Why do councils use two different local connection definitions within their different housing application processes? Now, this is a real good question. You're not going mad. Councils do generally use two different definitions of the same word or the same phrase, local connection, but it means very different things depending on which way you're approaching the council for assistance. So I can't explain this without going into a bit of jargon. If you are in some sort of housing need, so you want social housing or you're homeless or whatever it is, you are interested in two parts of the Housing Act 1996, either Part 6 or Part 7. Don't worry about the rest of them, that's the only interesting ones. Part 6 is basically the definition of housing register applications, what councils need to do. But crucially, councils can set them locally, and that means you can get a real broad range of how councils apply local connection around how long you need to have lived there and so on. Whereas Part 7 is the same across England. So it makes sense if I start with the Part 7 definition of local connection, which is you've lived in settled accommodation for either 6 out of the last 12 months or 3 out of the last 5 years, or you've got close family living in the area for 5 years, or you've got a permanent employment contract. And there are some special considerations as well. So if you, for example, you've been rough sleeping, a different set of criteria will be applied, or if you come through the immigration system. And there's a lot of other stuff you need to know around what counts as close family, that sort of thing, which I've done separate videos about. But that's the Part 7 definition. As I say, it covers the whole of England. I don't know what the definitions are in Wales and Scotland. They use a different set of law, but as I say, England, that's the definition. And if that's our starting point, it's worth saying that essentially the further away you are from London, the more and more like the Part 7 definition, the Part 6 definition will be. I hope that makes sense. So if, for example, you go to the extremities of the country, so Dover down in the southeast or Northumberland up in the northeast, they use essentially the same definition as the Part 7. So they will have local connection criteria in the Part 6 process, which is living in there for 6 out of the last 12 months or 3 out of the last 5 years, or 3 out of the last 5 years. The closest you get to London, however, so if you go right to central London, or certainly the most extreme one I know is Hillingdon, which is I think West London, you need to have lived there continuously for 10 years if you are wanting to gain local connection for the Part 6 process. This is where things start going wrong for people. Let's say you've been living in Hillingdon for 6 out of the last 12 months, a short hold tenancy, the landlord issues a Section 21 notice to quit, no fault eviction, and within a few months you're going to be homeless. So you approach Hillingdon Council, and often what you'll be greeted by is an officer who either doesn't know what the law is, or they deliberately tell you the wrong thing to get rid of you. And they might say something like, oh, you don't have local connection because you haven't lived here for 10 years. And a lot of people then give up. They say, oh, you know, there's nothing else I can do. The reality is they should be dealt with under the Part 7 definition in that situation. So if you think of the Part 6 definition, there's this really kind of high hurdle to kind of cross. The Part 7 definition, it basically just goes around it, just kind of walks around it. You don't have to hop over too high at all. So 6 out of the last 12 months or 3 out of the last 5 years. And you'll actually notice from that definition under Part 7 that you can have multiple local connections all at once, because you might have lived one area, then another, you've got family dotted around and so on. You might have a job somewhere else. So you could have local connection to 5 different areas without too much difficulty. Or you might have no local connection at all, and you would still essentially have local connection for the purposes of the homeless application. So again, I've done videos about that. But crucially, if you make that application to Hillingdon, you get told that you haven't lived there for 10 years, so they can't help you out. You basically need to go back to them and specify, or ask them even before you get into it, how have you dealt with my application? Because the key thing between Part 6 and Part 7 is, if you approach under Part 6, which is the general online form, and in that form you give them reason to believe that you might be homeless in some way or might be threatened with homelessness, that is a homeless application under Part 7 immediately. Legally it's happened already. It's not when the council finally figures out it's happened, it's already happened. And the Code of Guidance, if you go to 18.6, the Code of Guidance, it basically says that councils have to be really careful to make sure that people approaching under Part 6, which will be their generic kind of online form, should be dealt with under Part 7 if they give the council reasons to believe they might be homeless. So for example, if you tell them that you're experiencing domestic abuse, or if you tell them that your home is not suitable for your health needs or something like that, that would be reason to believe that you might be homeless, and therefore your Part 6 application should be immediately sidetracked to Part 7. Now there is one situation where you wouldn't want that to happen. Let's say, for example, you are staying in a kind of short to medium term with family. You are legally homeless, you know, you are sofa surfing effectively with family, but you would rather continue doing that than going into temporary accommodation. And the benefit of staying under Part 6 is that you basically get more choice over where you ultimately live, because under Part 7 you either get given something and there's no choice at all, or even if you do get onto the housing register, you might only have 1 or 2 bidding rounds to bid, and if you don't get anything in that round, they'll just give you something that comes up. So Part 6 gets more choice. There is a case, I can't remember the name of the case actually, where that happened. The wording of the law said that basically you should be dealt with under Part 7 unless you expressly state you should want to be dealt with under Part 6 in that situation where you are legally homeless. So hopefully that will make sense. As I say, you don't need to worry too much about that if it went over your head. So yeah, with Hillingdon, the situation is they tell you you haven't lived there for 10 years. You go back and say, hold on a minute, have you actually taken my application as a homeless application? If they're sensible, they'll say, no, we haven't. Sorry about that. Let's actually deal with you under Part 7. Now, this is why it's so important when you're making homeless applications to not wander into the local council and kind of just ask for help or pick up the phone to them. You want to send an email, and that also involves the online form as well. Don't use the online form. Send an email which states this is a homeless application at the top of the email. Really important. That is going to trigger the homeless application. And the reason I say send it by email is you can prove what you sent when you sent it. Whereas if you go on the online portal or whatever, you send it off, I don't know, have they got it? You don't know what's happened to it. Whereas an email will state exactly when you made the application. And you also, if you really kind of want to help yourself out, you want to find out who your local councillors are and you want to copy them in and basically say, look, I really appreciate it if you help me out in this situation just by keeping an eye on the council. So that's probably what I would do in that situation. I'd send an email. This is a homeless application. You're basically saying this is a Part 7 application. Copy in your local councillors and set out exactly what it is you want the council to know. So anything about health issues, what benefits you're on, any sort of ID that you might have, bank statements probably are going to be needed at some point. Maybe not send it off in the first instance. All of those things are going to help you get assistance. The council's number one weapon to prevent people getting housed and kind of shoo people off to the next local authority is to tell people things like, oh, there's no local connection, there's nothing we can do. But it's not in writing, they just say it sort of over the phone or in person. And many people understandably think that housing officer knows what they're talking about. When you actually look at what training housing officers get, it is a joke often. Often they get no external training at all. There's no qualification for the role. There's no professional body of housing officers, even though they have a huge amount of power. And often their training is, watching a video or not even having to watch a video, just the fact that a video is available on their council's training system. So that's the first thing to understand is the housing officer probably doesn't know a lot about housing law in the first place. I would imagine many housing officers have never read their own allocation scheme or haven't read the Homelessness Code of Guidance. So that's something just kind of bear in mind. And when you get letters from housing officers, they seem like these guys must be experts. They're using all this jargon. It's all like brilliantly set out. They're just using templates. There are templates out there. You can get them for free. And they basically set out, and then really I would say they're designed to kind of equip housing officers to get rid of people as well, but that's another story. So you can go through and as I say, don't think that you can't challenge the housing officer on a decision. It should even tell you how to do so. And when it comes to things like local connection has been fobbed off, I would also complain because it's just gatekeeping, plain and simple. There's no excuse for it. It won't be a quick process, but you will potentially get compensation from the LGO at some point. So yeah, that can take a year or two, so don't kind of bank on it, but that's something that's worth doing because you're not only helping yourself out in that situation, you're raising the issue up to the chief exec of the council or whoever else are the power holders, and you're basically showing them how great a problem there is around housing at the moment. The big problem at the moment is that front-facing housing officers essentially will hide what they're doing from their superiors, and so the chief execs will rarely know what's really going on the ground. The councillors who are involved in it on the housing committees, they won't know what's really happening on the ground and just kind of how outrageous some of it is. So you need to tell them. That's the only thing you can do. Same thing with charities. Charities are often funded by local authorities. They'll also kind of prevent the higher ups and the influencers or whatever from actually knowing what's really going on. So they'll tell them, oh, we work with a verification process or whatever nonsense. And all of that is just hiding the fact that councils aren't following the law. And until it becomes a bigger issue, councils are going to keep not following the law, and the housing crisis is not going to be fixed. So it's worth doing even from that point of view. So I'll probably do some other videos about that kind of housing officer stuff because we've been doing some research around what training housing officers really get. I remember one, I think it was Northants, I did an FOI request to them, and they literally said, oh, we don't do anything around Housing Act 1996 at all. And I was like, that's staggering. What about priority need? What about the definition of homelessness? What about local connection? How do you housing officers know about it? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. So yeah, it's a real big issue. It's something that you can kind of do with your own local council, is just ask them about their staff training and all that sort of stuff, because it's a good way just to kind of, without kind of being too challenging, it's a good way to kind of raise standards across the country. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. If you've got a question about any of this, if you stick it in the comments, I probably won't answer you directly, but I'll take your question to the weekly live stream we do every Thursday night. So myself, my colleague Shannon, and Will Flack, who's a solicitor in London, we kind of work through as many questions as we can in the time period. Try and make the questions make sense, try and keep the questions on point so you're actually asking what it is the legal thing, because we can't help with a lot, we can't help with much, but what we can do is explain how the law should be done. And ultimately, you've then got to go and get your counsellor to actually follow the law. We got a question in the last week or so which basically said my housing officer just flatly refused to follow the law and just said that's not what the council does at the moment, and that sort of thing is not going to change until there's widespread challenges going on. So if you're homeless, it shouldn't be your job to get the council to follow the law. It should be someone else's, or they should follow the law anyway, but sadly that's the situation. And I'd finally say that once you get housed, don't forget about that experience, raise it, kind of use it to kind of get further improvements for other people around the system, because the more vulnerable you are, the harder it is to get housed. That's the way it is actually in reality, or the easier it is to gatekeep you if you're more vulnerable. And so by raising these issues and kind of stamping your feet a little bit, you're not just helping yourself and your family, you're helping those people out there who just don't have the resources right now to be doing it. So it's a really good thing, really valuable thing, far more valuable than soup runs in my opinion, by the way. But so that's something that I'll be kind of thinking as well. And again, if you got this far in the video, do subscribe to the channel. You get notifications when the live stream's going up. And also, if you're really keen on this, we do regular online training just via Zoom. So far we've got, we've always had really good feedback. We're up to about 4.8 stars, we're nearly 4.9 stars on Trustpilot. So it's just really good training course. It's 30 quid if you're paying for it yourself, 60 quid if you work for an organisation that they're paying. So that's just available for you as well. Just kind of check it out. I've put the link in the Eventbrite, on the Eventbrite link on the comments down just down below.